All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's live cooking demonstration. Just a couple things before we get started. We are going to be recording today's session, so if you'd like to share with a colleague or watch it again later, it will be available on our EDWS YouTube page. During today's presentation, if you've got questions or comments, please make use of the WebEx chat feature, and we'll try to keep an eye on those and address those at the end of today's demonstration. Additionally, if you're having any audio or video issues or any technical problems at all, use the chat box for that as well. Please make sure your comments go to all panelists. My colleague Cheryl Johnson-Ransaw is online, and she'll be able to see that message if you send it to all panelists so we can help out sort any of those issues that may pop up. With that being said, we will go ahead and get started. My name is Ryan Smith. I'm the Wellness Program Administrator here at Georgia State University's Employee Development and Wellness Services. By trade, I am a registered dietitian, so I love finding healthy recipes like this, looking at that nutrition information and figuring out how we can work it into our diet while still having the flavor that we love. So today's recipe is chickpea burgers with a tahini sauce. It's a fairly simple recipe in terms of equipment and what we're doing, though I will warn you, this one's a little more finicky than some of the recipes we've made in the past. If you've seen some of the previous demonstrations, it's been several months now, but we've made things like black bean burgers before. Typically, when we make those burgers, there are breadcrumbs or quinoa or some sort of carbohydrate type thing to help bind it together. This recipe is a little different, so the batter for the burgers comes out a bit softer, but I'll show you how to work around that because the flavor of this recipe is absolutely worth it. So it's worth dealing with some of those minor inconveniences. In terms of equipment, what you're going to need today, a cutting board and a knife. We're going to be using a large skillet on the stovetop, and then we're going to make use of a small food processor. If you've got a big one, that's great. You can use that as well. But if you don't have a food processor, small ones like this are very affordable, so I encourage you to pick one up. They're really great for a number of different uses. If you don't have a food processor like that, you can mix some of these things by hand using a bowl and the potato masher or the backside of a spoon. It's just going to be a lot more work. So I do encourage you to use the food processor or even a blender if you happen to have one of those. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to do is we've got our food processor here. And since we're making chickpea burgers, as you might expect, there are chickpeas in the recipe. Chickpeas are also known as garbanzo beans, and we're going to use a 15-ounce can of them. This is a lower sodium can, which I like. I like to keep the sodium a little bit lower in my dishes when possible, and then we can add salt back in as we please by using just the salt shaker or measuring out that salt. So we're going to do a can of those chickpeas or garbanzo beans, and we're just going to add those into the food processor. Now, chickpeas are awesome. They're a great source of fiber, and they're going to be the main source of protein in this recipe today. So they're really good if you're trying to have more plant-based foods, but still get that protein that your body needs. Chickpeas are really affordable and a good place to start with that. So chickpeas are in our food processor. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to use some green onions, and we're going to chop these up. And you can use about half of a bunch. When you buy green onions, they usually come in a little bundle. So you can do about half of that, or 3 to 4 green onions, depending on how large they are. What we're going to do for cutting them is you can decide how far close to the root here or the bulb you want to go. Some people will get down to the white area and trim that off, but you can cut all the way down if you want. It's really personal preference. And what we'll do is we'll curl our fingers into this sort of claw grip so that our fingertips aren't out. We want to protect them from the knife and kind of use the knuckles as a little bit of a shield. And then we're just going to rock the knife and slowly move the green onions towards it and make some little slices. Now, you want to try to make small-ish slices, keeping in mind, though, the food processor is going to help pick up anything you leave behind because it will shred these into smaller pieces. So just cut them into manageable slices, and the food processor will do the rest of the work. Now, nutritionally, green onions, there's not a whole lot going on there. Like any vegetable, they do have a variety of compounds in them that are beneficial for our health, though there's not a major standout in terms of like vitamins that we usually talk about when we look at things like green onions. That being said, they do contribute water to our diet. They do contribute fiber to our diet, which are both very good things. But the main use of this is going to be for flavor. They are going to add a nice little bit of, well, just what you typically expect out of an onion. As you cut into them, you can smell some of those flavors, those aromatics going into the air. And it's going to bring the flavor of the chickpea burgers up a notch and really help us out just in terms of the overall flavor profile. So we'll continue this process, cutting up that last green onion. Again, you don't have to be super particular since you are going to use a food processor to help chop these a little bit more. Okay. So we'll go ahead and add those in. Now, as you're using a small food processor like this, if you don't have a larger one, you will notice you're going to use most of the volume available in this thing. That may mean that you need to give it a couple pulses before adding additional ingredients so that it doesn't overflow, but you can kind of keep an eye on it and decide if you need to do that or not. I have larger food processors and they're great, but I wanted to try to use the smallest one I had today just to show you that you can make this recipe even with a really affordable one. So the next thing we're going to add to it is going to be our binder. It's our egg. That's going to help everything sort of stick together because these patties, whenever we make homemade like bean patties or chickpea patties, the biggest difficulty is that they tend to crumble, they tend to fall apart. So the egg helps everything hold together. Now, this is a vegetarian recipe, but if you are vegan and you do not want to use eggs, you can look into egg alternatives like an egg substitute. If you are familiar with a chia egg, that could be an option as well. You'll need to do some Googling and kind of look into that if you aren't already familiar, but you can substitute some other vegan options if you don't want to use that chicken egg today. But the first thing I'm going to do, as I mentioned, we are filling up the volume here in this. So I'm going to put the lid on it and just give it a couple quick pulses to condense it a little bit. I'll mute my microphone here so you don't have to hear the food processor. So give me just a second. Okay, and that helps free up a little bit of space so that we can fit the egg into it a little bit better. So for the egg, we're just going to use one. What I'd recommend doing, and really anytime you use an egg, rather than cracking the egg directly into the container that you're going to be putting it in, always like to use a small bowl on the side. That way, if you accidentally get pieces of eggshell, they're not going into the dish directly. Toss that real quick. And you don't need to whisk this or anything because it is just going to go into the food processor and it's going to mix it all up in there. So we'll go ahead and add that in. Okay. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to want to give this some flavor, right? Because right now it's really just the green onions and the chickpeas. So we're going to do a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. We're going to do 1/2 teaspoon of cumin, ground cumin, and then 1/2 teaspoon of oregano. And finally, my favorite ingredient whenever I'm adding flavor, we're going to do some minced garlic. And I'm going to do a teaspoon of minced garlic, which is equivalent to about 2 cloves of fresh garlic if you wanted to do the fresh variant. And that'll give it a lot more flavor for us to work with. So we're going to put the lid back on there. We're going to give it another pulse here. I'll go ahead and mute my microphone one more time. Okay. And you can see we're kind of starting to form almost a batter or like a dough as we mix these things together. And there is one more critical ingredient we're going to add, but I wanted to blend it first again to make room. You can use a spatula, scrape down the sides a little bit, and you can see we're getting a lot more room back into this so that we can add a few more things. Okay. And the last thing is really important. We're going to add a 1/4 cup of just all-purpose white flour. And what this really does is it helps thicken these patties up because they're very moist. I mentioned that that's always the struggle whenever I make like plant-based burgers at home is they're either crumbly or they're really wet. These ones lean on the side of being pretty moist and pretty wet. So we do want to add that flour in. It's going to add a little bit of dryness to help soak up some of that moisture and help them stick and be a little bit firmer. So we've got the flour added in. Again, that was a 1/4 cup. And then we'll do our final round of processing that here. Okay. And then after you've done that, again, I would recommend taking that spatula, pressing things down, scraping off the side. Since this is a smaller food processor and I added the flour in at the end, I can see it's mostly at the top of the mixture. That's okay, because what we're going to do next is remove the blades from here. And using that spatula, try to scrape as much of the excess off as you can. That is going to go into making those patties, so we want to save most of it. That's good enough for now, so we'll set that over here. And since the flour is on the top, I'm going to give it just a little bit of a stir, make sure that it is incorporated evenly into the mixture. And if you've got flour sticking to the side, go ahead and give it a little bit of a stir just to pick that up, pressing the chickpea mixture against the edge of it. So the next part is the hardest part of the recipe. This is the finicky part I talked about, but I promise you it'll work out. I made these earlier and they turned out great. It just takes a little bit of patience. So what's going to happen now is we are going to form these into about 4 patties. That's roughly how much it makes. If you want to make bigger ones, you can, or smaller ones, you can. It's up to you. But this mixture is going to be very, very sticky. So what we're going to do is we're going to use wax paper. We're going to form our patties on here. Hands are going to get a little messy. No big deal. We'll form our 4 patties on here, and then we'll take the wax paper to our skillet and transfer it over that way. I found that's the easiest way to handle this. So if you want to use the spatula to try to scoop out roughly a patty size, you can, but ultimately I like using my hands. If you want to just do the spatula method, you can press it down onto that wax paper. Again, you're trying to shape it into a burger-sized patty, so you can kind of decide what that looks like. So I'll get us started with the 4 patties by using the spatula, but I'm probably going to come back in at the end and use my hands to really press it together. You want it to be as firm and compact as possible for when it goes on the skillet to cook. So this is an interesting recipe because really what we're working with right now is not that far off from hummus, right? We've blended up chickpeas. We've added a little bit of seasoning. We haven't added oil or anything like that yet. We're going to put that on the skillet when we cook it. But we've got ground up chickpeas with some different herbs in it. And that's very, very similar to how you make hummus. And the consistency of this right now, I'm not sure if you can tell how soft it is. It is not quite that liquidy because we added the flour, but it's close to hummus. So it's almost like we're making these patties out of hummus, which is very strange. When I first saw the recipe, I thought to myself, is that going to work out? You know, is this going to be able to transfer to the skillet? And it does. And they end up having a really fun flavor and a really nice texture because of that. So I'm just scooping out the remains, trying to get as much of it as I can, and just making these patties close to even. Like I said, I'm aiming for 4, but if you wanted to break it into 5, you absolutely could. That is up to you. Okay, we'll get a little bit more, and we'll add this one. Okay, so this is the part where I prefer to just use my hands. I'm going to flatten these down and try to shape them into those round patty shapes a little bit better. And keep them separated. You don't want them to stick together or else you'll just get a really big double patty. So normally whenever we've done black bean burgers before, they are definitely a little bit drier. They tend to be crumbly and they won't stick to your hands as much. But as I mentioned, these will not have the crumbly problem because they do have a lot more moisture in them. I'm going to rinse my hands real quick. And now what we're going to do is we're going to move to the stovetop and we are going to set the skillet over medium-high heat. And we're going to add 2 tablespoons of a cooking oil of your choice. I'm just going to be using canola oil today. Okay. So while that heats up, what we're going to do is get these ready. The best thing to do is to transfer the wax paper over there. If you want, you can slide a plate under it. I usually just pick it up and hold it tight. I'm not moving it that far, so it'll be okay. And you'll want a spatula handy because essentially I'm going to flip the wax paper over press it towards the pan so that these patties make contact with the pan, and then use the spatula to help peel the wax paper off. Again, it's a little bit of a process, but I think the final recipe definitely justifies it because it does taste very good. So we'll give that a couple more seconds to heat up. I do want to talk about some of our other ingredients while we wait on that. The other element of this dish is, of course, the tahini sauce we're going to make. So for that, you're going to need just a smallish medium bowl. We're going to mix a couple things in there. We're going to be using tahini. We're going to use a little bit of plain Greek yogurt, some lemon juice, some salt, and some parsley. So it's a very simple sauce, but it has a nice balance of sort of the bright acidic flavor of the lemon juice. You get some of the savory, fatty flavor of the tahini, and then there's a little bit of the dairy coming from the yogurt. It's a really nice blend. So let's go ahead and try to transfer these over. Again, we're going to take the wax paper, press it against the skillet, and then use the spatula to help peel it off. Be mindful as you transfer it because they are, they're very moist. I'll show you. So I've just placed it flat like that, and now I'm going to peel it off and use the spatula to help me with that. Okay, so you can see that that transfer went really well, even though they're very mushy. They transferred just fine, and they're holding their shape. So we're going to let these cook. And we'll cook for about 5 minutes on that first side. Our goal is for them to get to that crispy golden brown. The edge will firm up. And once you cook that first side for about 5 minutes, they actually become really easy to move around. In fact, I'll show you. I've got one we pre-cooked over here. After you've cooked them, they have that nice kind of grilled mark on them. They become very firm. They hold up really well. They don't crumble, which is what I was so impressed by. Because all the other bean burgers I've made before, usually they kind of fall apart and you have to put them in the burger very quickly, but these hold together. So again, about 4 to 5 minutes waiting for them to become a golden brown. While those cook, let's go ahead and start working on our tahini sauce I mentioned. So we'll start with tahini. And if you're not familiar with tahini, it is ground sesame seed. It's sort of like if you make peanut butter out of peanuts, you would make tahini out of sesame seeds. It's a similar process. There's not much sugar in tahini, so it doesn't have the same flavor as peanut butter, but it's great for making Mediterranean-inspired dishes or making sauces like this. If you've had tahini for a while and it's been in your fridge, you do want to give it a stir because the fat, the oil can separate from the rest of it, just like natural peanut butter does. And we're going to measure out 2 tablespoons of that and put it into our bowl here. Tahini does seem to be pretty sticky, so you may want to have a little spatula nearby to help you scrape out of the tablespoon, or you can just sort of tap it on the side to get what you need. So we will move that over here. All right. And then the next thing we're going to add, we've got the 2 tablespoons of tahini. You're going to do half a cup of plain Greek yogurt. You want it to be plain because you want it to be a little tart. We don't want to have any sweetness in the sauce, so no need for a vanilla yogurt or any fruit-flavored yogurt. Just the plain Greek yogurt will do perfectly. And we only need half a cup, so I actually just bought one of the little individual single-serving containers of yogurt. I used half of it when I made the recipe earlier, and I'm using the other half now. And these are roughly 1 cup, so it works out nicely, so you don't have to buy a full container of yogurt for this recipe if you don't want to. Okay, we've got that in there. We're going to add a tablespoon of lemon juice, a 1/4 teaspoon of salt, and then we're going to do parsley. And what you're going to do for the parsley is, we've rinsed it already. I'm just going to bunch it up. I'm going to use my knife here and doing that claw grip again to protect my fingertips. We're just going to run the knife through it and make some small cuts. Our goal is just to get these into smaller pieces, try to avoid the big stems if we can. And we only need about 1/3 cup of this. So you can eyeball it or measure it out if you prefer. 1/3 cup is really not that much. It's just a few tablespoons, if that's easier for you to picture. So I'm really just bunching it up, running my knife through, and then kind of repeating that process. Okay. And the parsley is going to add a really nice sort of earthy, herby flavor to it. Very green, very bright in its flavor profile. Right. And now we will add that in to our tahini dressing that we're making, or the tahini sauce. And then using a whisk or a spoon, whatever you happen to have on hand, go ahead and mix those together. We're just going to mix until they're incorporated. We want the yogurt and the tahini to become one. You'll see them change to a lighter shade of brown as they mix. And using the yogurt and using the tahini, since we are using Greek yogurt, I do find the sauce comes out pretty thick. If you want it to be runnier, you can add a little bit of water, just like a tablespoon at a time. So I'm going to do that real quick. And then you can whisk it again, and it'll be a little bit more of a sauce texture. And then if you make it too thin by adding water, you can always thicken it back out by adding a little bit more tahini if you'd like to. But we want it to be closer to a salad dressing. We want it to be thick, but run a little bit so that we can sort of drizzle it over things. So this is getting closer to what I'm looking for. So we're going to set that to the side. And I think it's been about 5 minutes. I'm going to check on the patties real quick. Okay, we're going to give those about another minute. I really want that bottom edge to get that golden brown, because once it does, that helps the whole thing stick together. So when you flip them, they're less likely to fall apart. So you can peek at them using the spatula, see how brown they are. We'll give them a little bit longer, and then we'll flip it over and cook for usually just about 2 to 3 minutes on the second side. The second side tends to cook a lot faster because it's already heated through partially. The pan's nice and warmed up, so definitely keep an eye on them after the flip. Now, while we wait on that, let's talk about how we're going to assemble this. So you can eat these burgers on top of a salad by themselves, however you really want to do it, in a wrap. The recipe, though, calls for using whole wheat pita bread. And the reason for that is because whole wheat pita bread is going to be higher in protein, higher in B vitamins, and have more fiber. So there's a lot of good nutritional aspects to it. So you can buy these in the bakery section of most grocery stores. What you'll want to do is cut one in half. You can heat it up first if you want. That will make it a little more flexible if you're worried about it breaking as you try to put the ingredients in it. But we'll cut one in half, and that gives us a nice little pita pocket that we'll be able to fit those burger patties into in just a moment. So let's go ahead and flip these. I want to try to show you what we're looking at here. So you see how brown they are on the top? That's the perfect amount. So we knew it was time to flip them. So about 2 to 3 minutes on that side now. If you ever made falafel before, it's kind of similar to this. We're using parsley, we're using chickpeas. Falafel is a lot more fried though, so we're using much less oil, making this a healthier choice. So you'll put your patty in here. What I like to do is take the tahini sauce that we made, and let me get a spoon here, or actually I'll get a knife. I like to take the tahini sauce we made and scoop some of that up and sort of just prepare the pita pocket by spreading it on the inside. I want there to be a little bit on all the different surfaces, because this is really where the flavor comes from, in my opinion. The chickpea burgers taste great and have a good texture, but the sauce is what really makes it. So I like to spread that throughout so that I know when I put the burger in, I'll get a little bit on each bite. And then if you want to, you can add some additional toppings. Like I'm going to put in just some mixed greens, sort of stuffing that pita pocket with some extra veggies that we can enjoy. And then I have a tomato here. If you'd like, that's another option. You could slice some tomatoes up, fit those in nicely. The picture at the beginning of the presentation had that, and I think that works really well too. So we'll pause here for a second. Let's check on the patties. Okay, just about another minute on those and we'll be good to go. Let's talk a little bit about storage while we wait on that. So the leftovers for this work great in airtight containers in the fridge for up to 4 days. So if you want to meal prep, this does make 4 servings. Each serving is 1 patty and half of the pita bread. For storage, I recommend storing the patties separately and the sauce in its own airtight container, sort of like what you do with salad dressing. you mix it all together, it's going to make things get a little too soft from the dressing. So I like to have it separate, and then you can just add it when you're ready to eat it. Now, calorie-wise, it is a little bit smaller of a meal. So depending on how active you are or how big you are, you may want to do the 2 pita halves and 2 burgers. You may want to just do 1 pita half and 1 burger and then pair it with something else like a piece of fruit or another item you'd enjoy having alongside it. I think this works great for a healthy lunch. So let's go ahead and take these off the stovetop now. And again, I want to show you how brown they are. I can flip to the other side and you can see it's still got that nice brown toasted look to it, which is exactly what we wanted to see for all 4 patties. And if you flip one over and you find it's not quite as brown as the others, you can always leave it on the stovetop a little longer if you'd like to. I'm just gonna steal this guy and we'll use him as our sample. Now these are gonna come off being pretty hot, so just be mindful of that if you're gonna handle them like I'm about to. But we're just going to fit that guy inside of there. Now, in the photo at the beginning of the recipe, you could see they were kind of hanging out like that. One thing I did earlier was I would take the patty and cut it in half. And this is really, I think, the best demonstration of how well these patties work. They don't crumble when you cut them in half. If you've made bean burgers before, they normally do. If you cut them in half, you can fit the 2 halves in side by side, and you sort of have a nice double-decker approach there with the sauce and the greens, fitting in some tomato if you want to. If you're like me and you like to top things really excessively with all the veggies, definitely recommend microwaving the pita bread for just a couple seconds. It's just like with a tortilla. It'll make it a little more flexible, a little more malleable, and you'll be able to cram more of the good stuff in there. But if you're not a big fan of pita bread, like I mentioned, these are great on top of a salad. You could chop them up into little pieces, and that can be the protein that you enjoy. So pretty simple recipe. Again, they are good in the fridge for up to 4 days. Just store the patties separately from the sauce and you can enjoy it. In terms of substitutions, we worked with chickpeas today. As I mentioned, you can really make veggie burgers out of any bean or legume that you enjoy. You can make lentil burgers, black bean burgers, pinto bean burgers. It's up to you. This recipe, I think, works really nicely with the chickpeas. We're using a lot of flavors that work well with chickpeas, like the parsley, and some of the oregano and the lemon juice. It is that traditional Mediterranean-inspired dishes. So I like how that all comes together. Other substitute ideas, I use some greens. I had a tomato here. If there are other vegetables you like to do, like shredded carrots, for example, or some cabbage and chopping that up and adding it in, I think that could work nicely. And finally, if you don't want to use pita bread, having a big whole wheat tortilla, turning it into a wrap or something like that, or even just using regular sandwich bread or a hamburger bun and putting it on there, that could work well, especially if you're having trouble fitting it into the pita bread. Hamburger buns, I think, lend themselves to that. But you can still try to get the whole wheat variety to bump up the fiber and protein content. So I'm going to take a look at the chat here real quick. Someone mentioned the flax egg, like we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. Thank you for that. So the flax egg, definitely something to look into if you want to do it without an animal egg. If you want it to be vegan, you can use that flax egg to help it stick together. Some other questions here. I wonder if you can cheat and use hummus to start with. Good question. I would not recommend it. And the reason for that is that the difference between what we did and hummus is going to have a significant amount of olive oil added into it and lemon juice added into it. And those ingredients together will make it more liquidy than it already was. So we added the chickpeas, but we didn't add a whole lot of liquid on top of that. And we saw that it was a little mushy to begin with. So I think if you tried to work with just hummus, I think it would be too soft. You might have to add a whole lot more flour to it. So I would recommend starting with the chickpeas. I think the cheat might just get us into more trouble potentially. But I like the way you're thinking about that. Definitely an interesting idea. Question about when the recipe will be made available. Yeah, so after this presentation, you'll get an email, usually either on Friday or Monday, which will have a link to the recipe. You'll have all the instructions as well as the nutrition information. And it'll also include a short survey where you can let us know what you thought of today's presentation, if you've got ideas for things in the future, or any questions you might have. So we encourage people to check that out and give us that feedback. It really helps us improve our programs. Speaking of programs, we do activities like this all the time throughout the month, whether it's cooking demonstrations, yoga and meditation. We've got a book club coming up on Tuesday we're very excited about. We encourage you to look at the GSU web calendar. All of our wellness events are posted on there. Or if you're not already on our mailing list, you can email us at edws@gsu.edu. We'll get you on that mailing list, and we send out weekly emails to let you know all the good stuff we've got going on. So definitely encourage you to shoot us an email, and we can get you on that list. And I see Cheryl just put that in the chat. Thank you, Cheryl. So please reach out to us. We'd love to have you included in our upcoming offerings. We've got a guided meditation tomorrow at noon. We have a mindful moment on Monday at 11 a.m. And then on Tuesday at noon, we'll have the book club we talked about. And we'll actually have the author there as a guest speaker. So we're very excited about that. So thank you, everyone, for attending today. Keep an eye out for the email and a copy of that recipe so you can try this at home. As I mentioned, it's a little finicky, but if you use the wax paper trick, you saw it worked out pretty nicely. And I've made several batches of this and just really enjoy the flavor. So I hope you try it at home. Let me know if you make any fun modifications, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.